Hello, I'm Corey Brunell. I'll be your host for this edition of Inside View, and this is our second of 3 episodes that we're doing with our Congressman, U.S. Representative Tom McClintock. If you didn't get to see a chance to see the first episode, you should be able to find that on YouTube, and I want to thank you for joining us for this part of it. Congressman, thank you again.
Again, my pleasure.
Well, you're gracious with your time, so again, thank you for that. On this episode, we were going to talk a little bit about the Mueller report. Of course, you've been able to interview Mueller yourself, and I know you're kind of right in the thick of what's going on there in the House as far as testimony the other day and just investigation of it. So why don't you go ahead a little bit about your take on the report first, and then I've got some specific questions I'll ask you.
First, we have to understand, Mueller pulled together one of the most partisan groups of Democratic activists we've ever seen on any single investigation, and included people like Peter Strzok, whose infamous emails were later found by the Inspector General, and he was Mueller fired him, but never asked about political biases of any of the investigators, he says, who were investigating this, obviously highly political question. What we found was all of the investigators who made political contributions had all contributed to the Democrats. Not one had been contributing to Republicans. The amount was staggering, about $60,000 among all these investigators. So, I mean, you had what Greg Jarrett of Fox News calls a team of partisans. They were given 22 months, somewhere between $25 and $35 million to do this investigation, and try as they did with all of the resources, they could not make a legal case on collusion or obstruction. So I'm afraid they may have made a political case, and I say that because of this. What's in the Mueller report, even though they could find no evidence of collusion, we have to trust the report to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, to completely, fully, and accurately reflect the underlying evidence. And the reason for that is we can't see the underlying evidence. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I've only been permitted to review about 75 pages of the 302s that were underlying evidence, and then I'm not allowed to discuss them. So we have to trust them on this. But what we're starting to discover after the report was released is that the report is not giving us the whole truth, nothing close to the whole truth. For example, John Dowd was the president's lawyer. He calls the lawyer for Michael Flynn. The Mueller report cites a portion of the message that he left on the lawyer's machine. It sounds pretty bad. It says, hey, we need a heads. Basically, it sounds like he was tampering with witnesses. But in the Flynn case, the judge ordered the release of the whole message. And in the whole message, Dowd makes it absolutely crystal clear that's not what he's suggesting. They only took a small portion of the message that looked incriminating. They had the full message, which made it very clear it was not. They chose not to put that in the report.
Took it completely out of context.
Exactly right. I asked him about that.
You pressed him on that.
I asked him about that, and he refused to answer. He was evasive.
Right.
Another point is Konstantin Kilimnik. Konstantin Kilimnik is cited throughout that report as having ties to Russian intelligence and the Russian government. He was a long-time a business associate of Paul Manafort. What the Mueller report didn't say, and we've later discovered, is Kilimnik wasn't a Russian intelligence asset. Konstantin Kilimnik was an American intelligence asset working for the State Department, and they never, ever mentioned that in their report. And then the thing that I find the most incriminating, and this is coming out now in the...
These are lies of omission, by the way.
Exactly right, and giving an entirely false impression. They still couldn't make a legal case, but they wanted to make a politically negative case against the president this team of partisans. And they did that by deliberately distorting or hiding information. And one of the things that we're told over and over again, since all of this began, was, well, Russian intelligence was running internet troll farms. They were polluting our democracy with propaganda hidden from view. This is how Putin was helping his stooge and crony Donald Trump. Well, what happened was the troll firms decided they would fight this in court. So there's actually a court case going on in federal district court in D.C. right now on this subject. The defendants came to the judge and said, hey, Your Honor, these prosecutors are, throughout this Mueller report, are saying that our clients were connected to the Russian government. That's prejudicial. And they have to produce evidence. And the judge says, you're absolutely right. Show us the evidence. And Mueller's prosecutors could not produce any evidence. The judge says, if you can't produce evidence and you're making these prejudicial statements, you're in contempt of court. You're in violation of the court's rules. And I will so hold you in criminal contempt. The very next day of that hearing, after that hearing, Mueller has this no questions to be asked press conference. Announces that he's concluded the investigation. Well, we already knew all of that. The one thing he said that was new is there is, of course, and I'm paraphrasing now, but there's a distinction between Russian individuals charged and the Russian government, which completely contradicts his own report, but gets his prosecutors off the hook with the federal D.C. court. And the judge then comes back in a subsequent hearing and says, okay, now that Mueller has made that distinction, I will hold this in abeyance for now. Even though you've produced no evidence to support these claims, at least you've now made it clear that you're not making the claim that you're charging Russian individuals not with any connection to the Russian government.
Though the report makes the connection.
Exactly, and so Mueller in that one line contradicts his entire report, but it gets his prosecutors off the hook for criminal contempt in an ongoing court proceeding. So I asked him about this. I said, did this have anything to do with your press conference? After trying to evade the question for a while, he then says no. Well, that doesn't pass the smell test, and there are a number of investigative reporters. In fact, there's an article just the other day from Real Clear Investigations going into this in great detail. My suspicion is the Inspector General's office is going to be very interested in looking at this. The U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, who is looking at how this whole monstrous hoax came into being in the first place. I mean, don't forget, this was a hoax that was perpetrated in two ways. One, through the phony dossier that we later find out was paid for by the Clinton campaign through a group called Fusion GPS that Mueller, during the investigation, said he'd never heard of. Fusion GPS is the one that commissioned this phony dossier, used Russian sources, by the way, of disinformation to populate that with lies. Fusion's one of Fusion's top people is married to one of the top people in the FBI that was involved in this investigation. I mean, the skullduggery that's going on is just enormous. So that was one thing they used to predicate, among others, FISA warrants to spy on an opposition political campaign. Right. But the other thing is this fellow Joseph Mifsud, who again is identified in the Mueller report as someone with ties to Russian intelligence. We now discovered, no, he also had ties to American intelligence, and that was never revealed in the report. He is the one who first told George Papadopoulos that the Russians had some dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of emails. Papadopoulos then tells an Australian diplomat. The Australian diplomat reports it to the Department of State, and that was the genesis of the investigation that they then leaked to the press, so that during the 2016 campaign, everybody was hearing, Donald Trump is under investigation for collusion with the Russians. Well, it turns out that wasn't coming from a Russian intelligence source. That was coming from Joseph Mifsud, an American intelligence source that was never revealed. all of this is now being looked at by
his
the U.S.
connection
Attorney.
is American intelligence came out because of John Durham's investigation. Right.
And what I think we're going to find between the Inspector General's report that's due out fairly soon and the U.S. Attorney's report is that the government that was directly involved, not only in trying to influence the 2016 campaign, but when they failed to do that, then took out, as Peter Strzok said, an insurance policy to use that same calculated, monstrous lie that Donald Trump is a stooge of the Russians in order to undermine the legitimately elected, constitutionally elected President of the United States. That is stunning. And if that is what was really going on, that's a game changer in American politics and should frighten the hell out of every American.
Rather than a foreign government, it was our own.
Exactly.
Unbelievable.
And that's what I think is going to start to come out over the next year or so as these investigations begin to report to the government and to the American people.
Well, the frustrating thing for us as the American people is the length of time it takes to get to the bottom of this stuff, right? I mean, a couple of years on the Mueller report, year and a half, 2 years, something like that. I mean, it sounds to me like, can we finally expect some indictments on the other side of this? Do you think that there will be some indictments that come about as a result?
James Comey could have been indicted for leaking classified material. He wasn't. Not because they're, well, that's what a lot of people are asking. Now, by the way, they didn't decide not to charge him. They decided not to charge him at this time, which leads me to wonder: do they have bigger fish to fry with James Comey, like obstruction of justice, or there are much more serious matters that have not yet been revealed involving obstruction of justice. Time will tell on all of this. But I am confident ultimately the story is going to come out. Longfellow put it this way. He said, the wheels of the gods grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. And I think in the full course of time as these investigations proceed, we're going to get a much more complete picture of what was going on. And it may be a much more frightening picture than some ham-handed propaganda attempts by the Russian government.
Right. Yeah. I guess the Mueller report, if anything, it seems to me it's useful in now it's bringing to light some other things that need to be investigated. I mean, that we see that, obviously. You've mentioned a couple of them. Are there even more that you know about?
Oh, yes. There's some I can't talk about that involve foreign governments pumping money into the Clinton campaign. And that's all, you know, that is material that I am sure will be coming out in coming days.
Yeah, and part of Durham's investigation is, well, a large part of it, not just part of it, but is the background of the production of the dossier, the Russian dossier, and how that came into the hands.
What's starting to interest me a lot more, and you're right, I mean, that was all just
and then there's a Clinton connection there that we need to get to the bottom of.
And that's all tawdry, but the thing that's really starting to concern me is we had a highly politicized intelligence community. You had John Brennan and you had James Clapper, who were the most brazenly partisan people that I've seen on the national stage in many years. They were operating the intelligence agencies of our country. An intelligence asset named Joseph Mifsud is the one that started this circular report that the Russians had dirt on Clinton, and Mifsud, who actually invited Papadopoulos in order to inform him of this to get that out there. Again, there's a lot we don't know yet, or at least a lot that's not been revealed yet, but it appears to me it was very carefully calculated by the Obama administration to put out into the body politic this absolutely poisonous lie. And to use it, as I said, not only to try to influence the election, but when they fail to do that, to try to undermine the constitutionally elected president. Again, a lot we still don't know, but that's the picture that's starting slowly to form, and it's frightening if it's true.
With the Mueller report, there was, at its initial release, there was a lot of haranguing from the left. Released the whole thing. There were redactions due to jury There was
There's grand jury testimony,
grand jury testimony,
ongoing
absolutely,
investigations. There are certain, and it would have been illegal for Barr to again, the only requirement, the legal requirement was for Mueller to present that report to the Department of Justice. No requirement that it be made public.
That's right.
Barr agreed to make it public because of the fact that it is an intensely political question and the public has a right to know. So he released every bit of it that he could legally.
Yeah, without
there were
breaking the
certain
law.
Parts that were in the report that it would have been illegal for him to release. As those, but again, some of those involve ongoing court cases, and we're starting to see the documents emerge from those court cases. That's how we know about how Mueller misrepresented the John Dowd message to Flynn's attorney. That's how we know that they had no evidence and had to back off from the claim that the Russian government was sponsoring troll firms to intervene in the election. So as those court cases come out, I think we're going to see more and more detail. But I happen to agree. I would like to see all of the 302s are the FBI interviews with witnesses.
Okay.
From what I've seen, there's a lot in them that is very disturbing and was completely ignored by Mueller's team of partisan investigators.
Well, you're getting to the point, or the crux of what I wanted to get at is when do we maybe get to see all of that stuff? And so as the wheels of justice turn here, it starts to come out a little bit at a time. And these court cases are important in that regard.
Well, I certainly hope by this time next year we'll have a much more complete picture of what was going on. And if it was, as is now beginning to appear, an effort by top officials in our intelligence and justice agencies. Again, agencies that are entrusted with the most terrifying powers that we give to our government. The power to ruin people's lives, the power to influence the course of events. Those are terrifying powers, and they have to be used with the highest and utmost degree of integrity. And if we find out that we had officials in those agencies that were using those powers to distort and influence the fundamental functioning of our democracy, well, that's going to be a story of the century.
Yeah, those are criminal acts in nature, aren't they?
They're worse than criminal acts.
Yeah, well,
they undermine the very foundations of our Constitution.
But they can be prosecuted and put away.
Yes, they can be.
Okay. So for example, look at the IRS targeting of Tea Party nonprofit groups a few years ago during the Obama administration, and yet no prosecutions. Now, of course, that was during the Obama administration, but why no prosecutions after the fact? There were individuals
there should have been
targeted.
Another very important question, and I don't have an answer for it. They should have been.
We have a Republican administration.
That was the canary in the coal mine. I mean, that was the first time where we saw laid out in the open how again, these are as far as domestic agencies go, the
IRS
the FBI and the IRS can absolutely ruin your life. And the use of the IRS for political purposes, and by the way, it worked. I know a lot of people who were very active in the Tea Party, and after that, they said, "I don't want anything to do with politics anymore. I don't want to be singled out for an audit. Just leave my name out of it. I'm withdrawing from politics." A lot of folks out there like that. So it had a very, very depressing effect on the right of Americans to participate in their government. There are an awful lot of people who were exercising that right who are now scared to death to exercise it years later, even under a different administration, because they already saw that power abused once.
Right.
We cannot allow that to continue. And if that spread to our intelligence and our justice agencies, oh my God. Right. And that's what we have to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, and there just aren't, there are just congressional investigations on this topic. It's kind of like almost, they're done for kind of a dog and pony show, and then there's no bite on the other side.
Well, don't forget that, I mean, it was I Googled this a week after the election of 2016, we were already hearing calls by the Democrats to impeach Trump. That was like 2.5 months before he had even taken the oath of office. The very day after the 2018 election that made Jerry Nadler chairman of Judiciary, he was overheard by a reporter on an Amtrak train on the phone plotting how they were going to impeach Trump. The day now, he sits back in his chair and he says, well, we're trying to follow all the facts. We're trying to assemble a record. Come on. We know exactly what you're doing. You were overheard plotting all this the day after the 2018 election. You guys have been calling for this since before Trump even took the oath of office. This is all phony. And I just hope the American people see through it in time.
Well, phony narratives are, well, they're pretty much part and parcel for Washington, right? I mean, that's what they've got to do: control the news stories and the news flow.
But the good news is, ultimately, the truth will out.
Yeah.
I firmly believe that.
Yeah. Well, anything else you want to say on the Mueller report? Otherwise, we'll transition to another topic.
That pretty much covers it for now. Again, there's going to be a lot more coming out, I think, over the next few months. We'll know what's going on seriously with the, or at least how serious is the Durham investigation if a grand jury is impaneled to start issuing subpoenas.
Yeah, let's talk about that process then for our viewers as to kind of what time frame could look like there.
Well, again, we don't know. I was with a group of members who met with David Horowitz, who's the Inspector General. The Inspector General has jurisdiction only over the Department of Justice. He told us he'd already concluded the first round of, this was probably a month ago, concluded the first round of interviews. He was now having to go back and re-interview a number of witnesses before they could complete the report. Now, that's all he said. I don't have any inkling of what is in that report, except to read between the lines and say, well, wait a second. If you had a bunch of witnesses you have to go back and re-interview, that's because you came across information that suggests that they didn't tell the truth. Mm-hmm. Why else would you have to go back and re-interview them? Mm-hmm. That's speculation on my part, but we'll see. He left us with the impression again several months, well, about a month and a half ago, that the report would be coming out fairly soon. So, again, I can only give you that information. That's all that I have.
Yeah. Now, the separation of powers has been interesting to watch play out here, as Attorney General Barr has been one of those officials with a backbone and has told Congress either yes or no, you cannot have this, and he's had every right to not provide any portion of the report.
And by the way, that's not new. That's normal tension between the executive and legislative branches. That's engineered into our process of government. Congress does have legitimate oversight authority, but it does not have the ability to impede the work of the executive. And the record, I mean, is long and absolutely consistent and crystal clear on this. Where the executive is administering the law, is having conversations among, looking at options. It's called executive privilege. Mm-hmm. Executive privilege is inferred from the separation of powers itself, and it basically says when the president is having a discussion in the Oval Office on public policy, that has got to be privileged information, because people have got to feel free to offer him all sorts of off-the-wall ideas, think outside of the box, say things that might not be politically popular and that they wouldn't say and wouldn't advise him if they knew that this was suddenly going to be part of a congressional record. There are certain exceptions to that. They're few and far between. I know that I think every president since Truman, the Congress has attempted to subpoena records from. The executive has claimed executive privilege, and every time the courts have sided with the executive on this. They even tried to subpoena, after Truman left the White House, they tried to subpoena Truman and his now former advisors, saying, well, you're no longer part of the executive branch, you're no longer covered by executive privilege. And the court stepped in and said, oh, wait just a second. They are just as covered by executive privilege outside the office as they are inside, because if they're not, then you've got the same problem. People aren't going to give the president candid advice knowing that it's going to come out a year or two later after he leaves office. You cannot do that. And that's why I think Nadler is going to be rebuffed every step of the way to the extent he actually presses it. I think mainly he wants it as an issue. He knows he can't get that information. He knows there's nothing incriminating in that information, but he knows he can demand it, not get it, and then say cover up. Well, how do you cover up a crime that never happened? Right. How do you charge obstruction of justice when the president did provide to the special investigator, to Mueller, every single document that he requested, and did so voluntarily?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple things at play here. Obviously, Mueller was trying to prove a Russian connection, an inappropriate one, but also then obstruction of justice, and there was no claim laid there. Oh, did you see anything in the report and in your reviews of things that were clearly obvious
Absolutely
contradictions?
not. What the Democrats are pointing to is a man who had been falsely and wrongly accused, blowing off steam behind closed doors, that produced absolutely zero action whatsoever. I mean, and even if he had taken action, that's within his constitutional authority as the chief executive. So, and the chief executive law enforcement officer as well. So, I mean, this whole thing is one of the more ridiculous episodes in American history. But if what's now starting to form is true, that these agencies were using governmental powers to corrupt our elections and to influence basically undermine the democratic process, that is very, very concerning.
There couldn't be, think in American history, there couldn't have been a greater scandal at the highest levels of office. I'm thinking maybe the Teapot Dome scandal, but
Teapot Dome was basic garden variety corruption. Terrible,
it
awful.
Wasn't the use of government to target people.
Exactly, and to undermine the most fundamental of our democratic institutions, our elections, and the constitutional process that through which we elect a president.
Well, and you look at Nixon's resignation. I mean, he was faced with this abuse of power, some perhaps involvement with Watergate, and he resigns. I mean, these pale. I mean, and that pales in comparison to these. These are monstrous.
Well, again, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but a picture is forming that's very disturbing, and we have to determine if that's what was happening, because it's starting to look like it was.
Well, thank you very much for the information on the Mueller report here. Now we'll all be watching it from a much more informed vantage point. Thanks.
Well, I think when the Inspector General's report comes out, we're all going to be a lot better informed.
Yeah. Well, we're near the end of our show, so rather than get into some other topics right here at the end, we'll go ahead and we'll call it a day for this episode. But I want to say to our viewers, thank you for joining us here on part 2, the second episode of 3, with our Congressman Tom McClintock here in District 4 in California. So thank you again, Congressman.
Thank you.
Corey Burnell, and thank you for joining us on Inside View. Hopefully we'll see you for episode 3.